everybody. It's Mr. Oliver here, talking about the Enlightenment. Yeah, you were right. You saw it right there, didn't you? At the top. You saw it up there. Nice. So, what is the Enlightenment? We talked about the scientific revolution. Scientific revolution is like, hey, we got new ideas about stuff. The Enlightenment is, hey, we got new ideas about stuff, and let's make it so everybody understands them. Let's make it so people can be like, hey, I'm part of this. I'm part of this new world. Let's start valuing things like, I don't know, knowledge. Knowledge, yeah. What about, oh my God, knowledge will lead to progress? But that's what they were doing, and that's what made it so special. In many ways, we are children of the Enlightenment today. A lot of the things we're going to talk. So, when we talk about the Enlightenment here, we got to talk about things that back then were new ideas, but like I said, you're going to be like, duh, Avi. And really, it's a popularization of progress, science, reason. The motto of the Enlightenment, dare to know. How exciting. Even more exciting if I was able to click here. My computer is frozen. Oh, snap. No, it's not. It's unfrozen. All right. So, the Salon movement. Let me hide this real quick. So, the Salon movement is something really that epitomizes the Enlightenment, and yet it's not the entire Enlightenment. In order to understand the Enlightenment, you got to understand that it begins in France. Why France? France is what all the cool kids spoke. Okay, if not France, they spoke French, but France is where French is from. So, everybody spoke French. It's the center of the Enlightenment. Everybody's like, oh man, when we write about culture, when we experience culture, when we interact with one another, we want to be French. For gosh sakes, nowadays, if Paris decides there's some new fashion, everybody in America is like, I care about that. I don't even know why. I just do. And all of that really has its roots in Louis XIV and his pattern of building France as the go-to most awesome place in the universe. Louis XIV, of course, had died in 1713, but after he dies, people are like, hey, France is still awesome, but now we don't have all that oppressive type monarchy that we used to. Not to say that Louis XV, his successor, is not oppressive. Don't worry. He has his moments. But compared to Louis XIV, France was kind of considered like, oh, hey, you know what? We're open to new ideas and whatnot. This is in comparison to the East and places like Russia under the less enlightened rulers, like before Catherine the Great, for instance, the Habsburgs prior to Maria Theresa. It was much more oppressive and stifling prior to them. Anyway, so they meet, people meet, they write books, they exchange ideas. Women even have a place in this movement by inviting fancy, smart people to come over to, like, just talk about philosophy. They call that the Salon movement. Now, I had a student that said, is that like in the Old West? No, it is not like the Old West. Those are saloons you're thinking of. A salon is not like a beauty salon, although it is pronounced the same. A saloon is like a bar in the Old West. A salon is like a, hey, come into my drawing room and we will sit around and discuss important things. Ooh. There's supposed to be a picture there. Where's the picture? My picture just didn't show up.
Narwhals swimming in the ocean, causing a commotion, 'cause they are so awesome.
Alright, got my picture there. I had to activate the narwhal sequence. Anyway, this year, you got all these fancy ladies. These are wealthy people, Avi. And then you got these, like, fancy old dudes, and they're all like, what's up, ladies? And they're all like, oh, talk to me about natural rights. Ooh. And they're like, oh, I would love to. What a topic. Well, was it John Locke who said in 1690 that all men deserve the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And they're like, oh, tell me more why we should have the right to life. Does that mean that we have no torture? He's like, well, we do. We in the Enlightenment do. We frown on torture. And she's like, oh. I don't really know what the people in this are saying. That's probably what they said, though. All right, so who are these old, they're not even that old necessarily, who are these dudes that are like calling them philosophers, but they're misspelling it to philosophes? What's philosophes? Or as the kids in my class would say, philosophes. That's a French word, not philosophes, that's mispronounced. Philosophes, or philosophes, same thing really, are French philosophers that believe in progress through education. And basically they're all like, yo, it's going to make the world a better place. Really, we have a great attitude, we being society, or at least European society, have a great attitude towards progress really until World War I. Because we're like, oh yeah, we're going to use science and make progress and it's going to be awesome. And then we're all like, we got all this progress, we got all this science, let's make machines and it'll make our lives better. Boom, they start making machines. Then World War I starts and they're all like, wow, all those machines just killed people. And that was not cool, bro. But that's a topic for a different time. Anyway, many of these guys believed in Deism. And Deism is the idea that God had created the universe, much like a watchmaker. And then, like a watchmaker, after his creation is done, he steps away. He's gone. He just watches. No pun intended, although it was a good pun. And you say, well, what's the biggie there? I mean, do they still believe in God? Yeah. But they don't believe that God intervenes on a day-to-day basis. That is to say, they do not believe in miracles. They denounce the church as propagating a lot of superstitious nonsense. And again, we're speaking in the plural here, like many of these philosophers. Again, you can't lump them all as saying like they're all exactly the same. But when we're speaking of them, many of them are deists, and many of them are, at the least, critical of the church, and that would be the Catholic Church, because that's the primary source of religion in France. And up to the point where there are actually atheists involved in there. Open, like, hey, I'm an atheist type guys, like Baron de Holbach. So it's kind of interesting. Deism, no one really calls themselves a deist nowadays. I mean, I'm sure if I Googled that, I'd find people. But, like, average people do not walk around being like, ooh, actually, I'm a deist. But think of it this way. If you believe in God and you believe that he's probably not involved on a day-to-day basis, but, you know, he's out there, you might be a deist. Or maybe your friends are. Or maybe not. I don't know. So what about authors of the Enlightenment and philosophers of the Enlightenment? We can't talk about philosophers without talking about my boy Denis Diderot. Now, Denis Diderot is the co-editor, although most times people just say he was the editor because the other guy that was working with him actually broke off from the project after a while, of something called the Encyclopedia. And I know you're like, I've heard of the Encyclopedia. It's called Wikipedia, actually. Before that, the Encyclopedia is the first attempt to collect all the knowledge in the universe in one book. Now, it's obviously not going to be one volume. It's going to be multiple volumes. And they're going to basically have experts on all manner of things writing articles for it. And it wasn't just Diderot. Diderot got all his little Enlightenment friends, all the other philosophers, and he's all like, yo, guys, I would like you to write for this. And they're all like, sounds good, Mr. Diderot. He's like, call me Dennis. And the idea was to present it without judgment, not in order of importance, alphabetically. And that offended the church. The church was all like, you got an article in here about atheism. He's like, yeah, it starts with an A. And they're like, yeah, but you don't say it's evil. You don't say it's wrong. You actually make arguments in its favor. And he's like, oh, that was written by Baron de Holbach. That guy is cray. And, I don't agree with him personally, but I think he's got a lot of interesting ideas, and I like to hear it, because exchanging ideas makes us all smarter, right? And the church is like, no, that's not okay, bro. And this, along with other things and weird things to our mind, like the fact that the French word for blindness begins with an A, therefore its inclusion in Volume 1 offends a lot of people, because it's not polite society talk. Makes people go like, wow, maybe we should do something about this, Dennis Diderot. So officially, it's banned. But here's the thing. Look at this. That's the first page. I mean, not literally the first page. A picture of the first page. You can't touch that. Well, you could, but it's just your screen. But if you look at this picture, most of the subscriptions to the encyclopedia are in France. And if you say like, well, but I thought it was banned. It's one of those things where it's like, it's banned, but it's not banned, It's like there are such big fans, including Louis XV, the King of France, including his mistress, the Madame de Pompadour. These have such big fans of this work that it's like it's not officially legal, but they're not going to try to stop it. You know what I'm saying? It's it's the iPod of its time. It's one of those things like, you're not supposed to have it out in class, or iPhone. But, a lot of people got it out in class. You know what I'm saying? Not in my class though. Okay, if anybody's in my class and they hear that, that's not a saying that it's okay. It's not. What about this bro right here? You got Voltaire. This is one of my favorites. Okay, Voltaire is genuinely funny, and I'm not saying that in a history teacher way where I'm like, yeah, he's funny, like, and then I tell a joke that doesn't make any sense. And you're like, was that supposed to be funny? It's like, it was hilarious in 1748. No. Voltaire writes this book called Candide, which in many ways is a lot like the movie Joe Dirt, in which its primary hero, your protagonist, Candide, is this, I like to think of Candide as dim-witted. And he just goes from adventure to adventure, trying to find his lady love who was abducted, and he experiences all these setbacks along the way, and he encounters the church, he encounters the government, all that. And, they have foibles and adventures. Candide? Like that. Joe Dirt, also like that. Mike. Dropped. Anyway, also, Voltaire is just awesome. That's not his real name. His real name is François-Marie Arouet. But Voltaire, you can see why people call him Voltaire, because it's kind of weird. It's like, I'm not saying if your name's Francois, or what's it, Marie, I'm not saying that's not manly. I'm just saying there's a reason they call him Voltaire. Nothing wrong with being called Francois-Marie, though. You want to be called Francois-Marie? You go. Be proud of yourself. I've been listening to Macklemore. I know. I want to share with you some quotes because I love me some Voltaire, and he's one of the most quotable individuals on the history of the planet. Also, if you have a chance, go back and actually read Candide. Like I tell my kids, if you have a chance, try to read it over winter break. But if not, at least read the Spark Notes or something, just so you know something about it. It's a really good book. He actually is a very, very stern critic of, he being Voltaire, not Candide, is a critic of the Catholic Church, vowing to crush the infamous thing. Actually, he's pleading to crush the infamous thing. Get rid of the church. Again, he's a deist. He doesn't hate God. He doesn't hate compassion. He doesn't hate good. In fact, he considers himself a very good person. Advocates for religious tolerance, all that. He just thinks the Catholic Church has outlived its usefulness, that they've grown bloated and corrupt. He says, here's an example, of all religions, the Christian should, of course, inspire the most tolerance. But until now, Christians have been the most intolerant of all men. Think back to the era of religious warfare, or relations between the Christians and the Muslims, or relations between the Christians and the people in the New World, and you can at least see where he's coming from. You might not be like, oh, yeah, that's totally right, but at least you could see like, oh, hey, okay, he's got a point here. He said, if God did not exist, it would have been necessary to invent him. Think about that one. Do humans require that? He's not saying there's not a God. He believes in God. But just think about it. It's an interesting thing to say. Superstition is to religion what astrology is to astronomy, the mad daughter of a wise mother. Now that one, he's saying, hey, religion is good, but superstition has crept in. We are burning people as witches. What's that all about? Why are we burning those old weird-looking ladies as witches? Not to say all witches are weird-looking. Again, be yourself if you're a witch. I'm not saying you should become a witch. Optimism is the madness of insisting that all is well when we are miserable. I think that's a great thing to write at the end of your AP test. Just after you've answered the questions as well as possible, just quote Voltaire, optimism is the madness of insisting that all is well when we are miserable. It's a funny quote. All murderers are punished unless they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets. Do you know what they're talking about there? Or he's talking about? The sound of trumpets, like an army. So he's saying, basically, we hate murderers unless they're killing for their country. He's making a little jab at like, hey, how come there's exemptions for killing, bro? What's that all about? Every man is guilty of all the good he did not do. Great quote. Huge advocacy of doing all you can to make the world a better place. Don't be apathetic. Don't just be like, man, the system is broken, dude. I can't change the world, so I'm just going to play Xbox. Don't be like that. My favorite Voltaire quote. I have never made but one prayer to God, a very short one. O Lord, make my enemies ridiculous. And God granted it. It is better to risk saving a guilty man than to condemn an innocent one. Can you tell what he's arguing against there? Huge opponent of the death penalty. And also he says, like, look, you know, we got to make sure our trials are fair, that we have fairness in our trials. And probably the most famous thing he said, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Voltaire is great. Voltaire, huge advocate of freedom of speech as well. In fact, he loves Frederick the Great because he's like, well, Frederick the Great, you know, ensures freedom of the press, freedom of religion. So he's a pretty good bro. In fact, they end up like being roomies for a while, which has led some to think like, kind of weird for two dudes, grown men, to be roommates if they have, you know, ladies in their lives. But I don't know. They do have a spat between them over a philosophical matter. But even after Voltaire moves out angrily from Frederick's palace, he still says nice things about him for the most part. So that's for you to research and decide. Oh, what about Jean-Jacques Rousseau? Rousseau does not like society. He thinks the best kind of person is a person who has limited access to society. So the best person would be someone who is far away from the maddening crowd, who is like maybe born on some remote island, away from big cities, away from, at his time, contemporary society, and they just grow up and they stay with a small group, and they are closer, he would argue, to a good person than us being modern, back for him, 18th century, obviously we don't live then, but modern people who are corrupted by society. It makes us selfish, it makes us greedy, it makes us want what others have. Now, Rousseau is not like, well, I'm going to go off and move to the woods instead. He's like, okay, well, you know, society has its perks, you know, I like society. But he says, he doesn't actually, he kind of hates society, but he's willing to accept it in order to publish books, I guess. And he also says an interesting thing about submitting to the general will. He says, look, if we're going to have a society, let's not have it be based around things that are not good. Let's have it be submissive to what the people want. Now, we don't always want easy things. But he says the general will would be like, for example, we should have traffic lights. He did not argue this. I'm using a contemporary example. He said we should have traffic lights. And why? Because we might not like having to go slow. We might not like having to stop at a traffic light, a traffic stop. But it's better for society because we ensure traffic safety with our lights and our laws and our speed limits and all that. You might not like school every day, but would you agree that it's better for us as a society to have an educated populace? Yeah. That's all Rousseau is saying, really. He's just saying, like, look, that's what's good for the big picture. Now, here's your negative on this. What if that big picture favors one majority group over a minority group? Rousseau doesn't really factor in the whole, what if people abuse this general statement I'm making in order to be racist towards people? So, later on, Rousseau will actually show up being quoted by Nazis in the 1930s and 40s in order to justify their beliefs. Rousseau would not have been a fan. He would have hated that. But it just goes to show, even people with good intentions can take things that are twisted and perverted by other groups later on in history. Here is a quote by Rousseau. He says, "The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, 'This is mine,' and found people naive enough to believe him, that man was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" This is a powerful quote, but it also is very interesting because one of my students made a point once. He said, that sounds like socialism. Now, socialism is kind of a response to capitalism. It's an 1800s thing, a mid-19th century thing. Early to mid-19th century thing. And later on it'll evolve into another form, communism, which you probably have heard of, even if you haven't heard of socialism. But Rousseau wasn't really thinking that way, but he is thinking along the lines of Thomas More, who you might recall from chapter 13 and 14, they talk about him, wherein he wrote Utopia and said that the source of all of man's problems is civil society and the idea that we have property that's private and people covet it. I mean, look at that. And you could also compare this to a famous American history speech by Chief Seattle, where basically he says the earth belongs to everyone. It's very interesting stuff. All right, let's go over here to the Baron de Montesquieu. Of course, I just had Suri tell me what the Baron de Montesquieu's real name was, and she took it off the screen because Suri is unreliable, my handy dandy, in case I forget something. But basically, Baron de Montesquieu, his real name is Charles, which means manly, actually. It has nothing to do with this. I'm just also named Charles, so I like to point it out. He is an advocate for the separation of powers in government. That is to say, he believes that you need to have a system of checks and balances, for lack of a better word, where you need to have a group that monitors the other groups in government in order to make sure no group is too powerful. Now, he's talking probably about like England's system, wherein they have the because he's not even born until after 1689, but that's when you already got the Bill of Rights by that point over in England. So he's saying, like, look at those guys. You got a king, but you also got a parliament. And here in France, where he does a lot of writing in France, he's Swiss by isn't he? I take that back. He's French. I was thinking of Rousseau. Rousseau is Swiss. Anyway, Montesquieu is a Frenchie. He's a French dude. He is an advocate for the separation of powers, as I already said. Also, satirizes the government in a book called the Persian Letters, which he writes anonymously, but everybody's like, that's so you, Montesquieu. And he's like, what are you talking about? I do not know. You're right. It is me. Anyway, in the Persian Letters, it's told from the perspective of a French dude, it's not a French dude, a Persian dude, modern-day Iran, who visits Europe and walks around and, like, makes observations about how silly things can be and pointing out, like, hey, that's kind of weird how, you know, this is sometimes and blah, blah, blah. So, he's fun. Now let's move over to the enlightened despots, sometimes called the enlightened absolutists, sometimes called the enlightened monarchs. I'm not trying to give a viewpoint here by using the word despots. I'm simply trying to expose you to, everybody remembers enlightened monarchs, not everyone remembers enlightened despots. They are rulers that are influenced by the Enlightenment. And by that I mean, they're like, well, okay, how can we make our people's lives better? How can we improve the lives of our subjects? How can we support science, literature, and knowledge? So, we'll see how they do. We got here, this handsome fella right here, Frederick the Great. In fairness, he is older at this picture here. But he is an advocate of religious toleration, although there's always a caveat here, right? Religious toleration was an unpopular idea prior to the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, everyone talks about it. Frederick goes further than most, but, did you guess it? That's right. He still is not as supportive of the Jews as he could be. And this is a huge range. He makes statements here and there throughout his reign that are very pro, like Moses Mendelssohn. He's this Jewish guy that's also an Enlightenment thinker. And at some points, he's very supportive of Moses Mendelssohn. At other points, he's like, yeah, but he doesn't get to go to our official Berlin Academy faculty. He's not a part of that. So there's that. He also, under his reign, makes it so Jews have to take a special oath while they're in court. This goes back a long, long time to all these anti-Semitic ideas that Jews cannot be trusted under the Holy Roman Empire, under the early Habsburgs, medieval Habsburgs. They had said, okay, no, you can trust them. They're okay, but they need to take a special oath. And then sometimes this oath would be anything from something humiliating to something just bizarre. Under Frederick the Great, it would be that they had to, I think, hold a book and wear like traditional Jewish headwear or something. In some ceremonies, I read that they had to like sit in a coffin carrying a sacrificial dagger, and that's from the Jewish encyclopedia entry about Frederick the Great. By and large, he's a good guy religiously. Just keep in mind there's a little caveat there about, yeah, but he's not so great to the Jews. He's not, like, awful terrible, but he's not good necessarily either. He's a patron of the arts, good friend of Voltaire's, supporter of Voltaire. They lived together for a while in a totally bromantic situation, I'm sure. Tries to do things to make sure that food remains affordable for his people. But then again, there's also the fact that Frederick the Great has a heavy military involvement. He's the one who decided in the War of the Austrian Succession, hey, Maria Theresa is a woman, she's probably weak, we can take some territories from her, and invades her and takes Silesia. That's not so enlightened by most people. He's involved in the partition of Poland. I'll talk more about that when I talk about Kathy in a minute. And he, after the 7 Years' War, essentially he says, look, I need to devote the rest of my reign to making my people's lives better. I've warred too much now. So sometimes people say his reign is like Sparta in the morning, the early part of his reign, and Athens in the afternoon. Athens is usually thought of as a more cultural type situation. Who's this pretty lady? This is Catherine the Great. Now, Catherine the Great, interesting thing about her. Obviously, she's a lady. compare McKay or any textbook and the way they write about her compared to most kings. Catherine the Great had lovers. She had, male. Even when she was older, she was like, "Yo, I still got young men, because YOLO." But why is that important? I might say. Compare that with like Louis XIV. Louis XIV had mistresses. I don't remember anything about his mistresses in your book, McKay, back in chapter 16, and yet you gotta mention Catherine the Great's lovers a lot. Anyway, let's focus on non-bedroom stuff with Catherine. She is an advocate of education for women, a supporter of the arts. She, at one point, actually even thinks of freeing the serfs. But she kind of comes to the conclusion that she really can't. She says, look, a lot of your Enlightenment ideals, they're great. I like them. But here in Russia, we're just too backwards to make it work right now. One of the things that helps cement her view on the serfs is that a guy named Emil Pugachev has a rebellion and tries to get the people to rise up against her. And after that, she's like, well, definitely not freeing you guys now. That's not cool. She's involved in the division of Poland. More on that in a second. And she also does censor her people when she feels that they are being critical of her or her policies. And some authors have attributed some corruption to her government. All right. So, Ollie, you keep talking about this partition of Poland. What does that even mean? Well, you got to go back to chapter 17, and something you probably didn't pay a lot of attention to was the part where Austria was repelling the Ottoman Empire, and they drove them back. And all of a sudden, Austria got a little bigger, and Russia got a little because if you really look at the map, if this is Austria and this is Russia, if they're not expanding southward, the only real place for them to expand is into each other's territory. So France, actually, says, yo, guys, maybe you guys can make a little compromise where you take apart Poland. And Poland's like, whoa, guy, I'm right here, bro. And Russia's like, well, that's interesting. Maybe we could divide it up. And Prussia's like, well, I'd need a little bit of that. And they're like, well, that's cool, Prussia. We'll give you a small amount, but a strategic amount. Prussia's like, cool. And Austria's like, so you'll give us extra land, give yourselves more land too, Russia? Russia's like, sounds good. And they do it. And they celebrate this in Europe as this big peace thing where, hey, we averted war between Russia and Austria. Yay. This is a political cartoon from the time here. You've got Catherine the Great here. Obviously, she's a little older in this picture. Frederick and Joseph II of Austria. Or back here you got Charles III of Spain and I just said it. Louis XV. And over here is George III of England. The idea is that England is snoozing while these three are dividing up Poland, shown here tied up, having trouble keeping their crown on. The crown has fallen off. Over here in chains is the Ottoman Empire. They're not involved anymore. And the balance of power is now being shifted from Great Britain being equal to everybody else to now, the author would say, Great Britain is no longer as represented. And you say, well, who was this made by? A British guy. So he's criticizing George III here, who is literally asleep on the job, and showing that, hey, guys, we should wake up because other people are getting powerful while we're not. All right, so Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa is a Habsburg, as you might remember. She ascended the throne, and immediately Frederick the Great, like a jerk, had declared war on Austria, successfully taking Silesia from her. He ended up respecting her, by the way. He did say that, the only true man amongst my opponents is that man in Austria. He didn't say that woman, that man in Austria. He's talking about Maria Theresa. he is an opponent that respects her, eventually. She is pretty enlightened. Now, pretty enlightened. I say that because she is a hardcore Catholic. And there's nothing wrong with being Catholic, but as far as religious toleration goes, she was not a fan. She is open about thinking that Protestants and Jews are problematic, that perhaps they need to be removed. She is, at one point, even thinks about kicking all the Jews out of her land, Reconquista style, but doesn't do that. She does do some good things. For example, she reduces the amount of work for the serfs by trying to give them more rights and taking away rights from the landlords. She does not get rid of serfdom. That will fall to her son in a slide or two. She's a supporter of education. Frederick the Great had established schools over in Prussia, and she's like, oh, that's a good idea. We need to do that too. So she does that. She did have people who enforced the Catholic faith and also decency by having actually a police force for it, for all intents and purposes. People who would check to make sure you were being good. Weirdly, and I like this because McKay talks about it, she had autopsies for everyone performed. She wanted to be able to understand what people were dying from and be able to like recognize causes, so then that she could go after, like, hey, how can we make so people aren't dying of this stuff? So, mixed grade. Her son, Joseph II of Austria, who you might recall from this slide right here. This is him right here. Here he looks all like, oh man, you want me to be part of this partition of Poland? In real life, he was a pretty big fan of it. Actually, his mom was not. Maria Theresa was not. But Joseph II says, hey, let's expand education, not just for the rich, for everybody. Let's have total religious toleration. Let's get rid of serfdom altogether. I mean, this guy, nobody's making arguments that homie is enlightened. But it's so much, so fast, that a lot of people are like, and then after he's gone, Austria goes back to serfdom. It's not really until the mid-19th century where serfdom poofs off the map of Austria. But hey, good try there, Joe. I want to talk about one more war. Really, it's people from Chapter 18, but it's dealt with more in Chapter 19. This is a war you've heard of, probably. You might remember, I'm assuming my audience is American taking an AP European class, but hey, who knows? Maybe you're not. But if you're in American history, probably in 8th grade or so, you guys talked about the French and Indian War, wherein the British and the Americans here in North America fought against the French and Indians, which really is a poor name for a war. I like the European name for the same war, the 7 Years' War. Boom. 1756 to 63. It's an interesting war. You've got Louis XV, who up to this time has been like, I'm not a fan of Austria. All of the Bourbon monarchs have hated the Austrians. We go back to the Valois monarchs. They hated the Austrians. This whole flippin' class, France has been at war with Austria. And then Louis XV says, plot twist. We are now friends with Austria. And he marries off his son to one of Maria Theresa's kids. She has a lot of kids. You might have heard of her. Her name's Marie Antoinette. You've heard of her, huh? Okay. She is head and shoulders above the other European monarchs. I guess you could say she's going to make an excellent head of state. But I digress. Anyway, he makes an alliance with Maria Theresa. They decide, like, we will get reestablish dominance over Prussia, and Maria Theresa's like, and I can get Silesia back. And everybody's excited, except this is AP Euro, so we don't really talk about the battles too much. There's Louis XV, looking quite dapper there. You might recognize him from the Doctor Who episode, The Girl in the Fireplace. And of course, that was the one with the Clockwork Man and the Madame de Pompadour. That was his Louis XV's mistress. And of course, that's back when 10 was the doctor. But I digress. So here's the real Louis XV, and there's Fred II of Prussia. And man, he's a rough-looking dude when he gets old. And there's MT. And at the end of it, France loses. This is like triple bad. And actually, it's interesting because it's like it's a world war. There's fighting in Europe. There's fighting in North America. There's fighting in India. That's multiple continents, son. And France, if they'd won this, would have really been in a great position to go into the 19th century. But as it was, they get wiped off the map of North America for the most part. They lose most of their holdings in India. And now the English are dominant in trade, have tons more people to sell to. On the bad side, some of these North Americans, these guys in a colony called America, will say like, yo guys, we don't really want to pay for this war. And Britain's like, well, pip governor, you're still totally going to pay for this war, because if you don't, who's going to pay for it then, eh? And America's like, yeah, but we're not represented in Parliament. And Britain's like, nobody in the colonies is represented in Parliament? And they're like, yeah, but we don't want to pay taxes. And they're like, you guys have the lowest tax rate of anybody in the British Empire. And we're like, we being America, is like, we're going to have a revolt. And then we do. And then America. All right, I'm going to stop there because chapter 19, the way I do it, kind of goes into the 18th century, and I like to deal with all that stuff by itself because, I mean, really, you can't go from talking about the Enlightenment to talking about giant, weird-looking cows. I'm not comfortable with it. So, see you when we talk about chapter 19, the agricultural revolution. That's a real crowd pleaser, that lecture, and all of that. So, adios. Bye-bye.